All right, hi everyone. It's time for another little podcast episode. It is the 2nd of January, and yes, I still need to paint my nails. So in this video, I just wanted to do a quick update on the Blender Cinema project idea because, a little while ago, you might know, I did a little video on this channel talking about a few Blender business ideas that I wasn't completely confident about, or I just thought it'd be interesting sharing them with people to see what they would think, just bounce it off the ether and see what comes back. And a bunch of people seemed really interested in it. Like, the whole idea about it was just having a place to present shorts, meaning like animated shorts, short films, created primarily with Blender to have them displayed in a streaming service-like interface on a dedicated website. And it would be completely free. Like, the whole point about it would be to stream content from other sources like YouTube. So all the viewership goes to creators, but it was just an idea to try and fix the problem of, first of all, people not knowing that certain short films exist, so it'll be like a discoverability service. And also it could just be like a congregation point to give people something to aim for. Like, because I think a lot of people sit there thinking, wow, I would like to make an animated short, but what's the point? No one will see it anyway. No one will watch it. Like, there's no kind of mental end goal for where it would be. So I think it would have been interesting to have, in this kind of hypothetical future where a project like that exists and does well, a place that people can strive to create content for, even though it's like a free and kind of open source system. I went into the idea and the general concept a bit better in that last video, but I thought in this one we could talk a bit more about like the more realistic side of projects like this. Like, if I was actually going to seriously consider turning that into something, like, what are the things that I think about from like a time investment standpoint? How would I approach it? And I just think it might be interesting, again, doing like a second round of bouncing these ideas around. So just to add a bit more to the description of the idea, it wasn't just going to be like a place to display and to stream the short film content. I would have wanted it to be like a nice community place where we can learn from each other as well, in the way that, if you can imagine all the cover artwork for all these different short films created by community members, when someone clicks through to take a look at that short film, they get more information, perhaps like a few behind the scenes videos as well there, something that could be done in collaboration with them, or maybe it's something that they've done themselves. So it would be a way that people can like actually connect more with the content rather than just passing by it on YouTube and thinking about it like some kind of tech demo gimmick. One of the spawning ideas for this project was that whenever we look at Blender Open Movies, we look at them primarily as tech demos, and and when we compare them to like video game cinematics, you think, okay, well, why do people obsess so much over video game cinematics when compared to like Blender Open Movies? And it's a bit of a stupid question because the answer is actually quite obvious. Video game cinematics are based on either pre-existing IPs or they're introducing new IPs for extremely popular high-budget projects, stuff that people are going to be integrating into their lifestyle, stuff people are going to be like cosplaying as in the future, these characters that have been like so well fleshed out. And I think like the key word here is lore as well. It's difficult to obsess over like a Blender Open Movie or just, a kind of a generic community tech demo type animated short, including things that I've done in the past, because there's no real lore to it. Sure, there's like a backstory created for a script, but there's nothing to obsess over. There's nothing to ask questions about. And you'd be hard pressed to find fan art for like, the animated content as well. But the thing is, like I said in the last video, I think a lot of that's got to do with the context of it as well. Because, when you watch stuff on streaming services, Netflix, Disney Plus, Paramount, Sky Go, BBC iPlayer, whatever, if you're inclined to like experimenting with watching new things, you're not going to have an innate understanding of like the lore of the show that you're watching for the first time if you haven't done any research about it. And even then, the show may or may not give you cues or clues inside of it that there is more to discover, and yet still people watching that and enjoying it could obsess over it and take it seriously as content. So I think there's like a big context difference between where we find the content and what we associate it with. If we take a look at like a really high quality animated short created in Blender by someone who, when you take a look at their channel, has done nothing like that before, like no story content, no animated content like that, and they've just got that, we kind of inherently don't take it as seriously. Maybe that's not the right way to put it. Maybe we compartmentalize it in a box in our mind because we know there's nothing more story-wise. This is a one-off thing. Also, I think there's like a trust element to it as well. Like in streaming service websites, when new stuff is added to the service, we kind of have this inherent trust that, okay, well, there's money has been put behind this. so it's something worth investing my time in watching. And naturally, we don't get that on YouTube, of course, depending on the channel. So the whole point about the Blender Cinema project is to create a website with a streaming service-like interface that presents community-created short films made with Blender, or not entirely with Blender, but using Blender, including some of the Blender open movies, with the hope that the different context of having a different type of interface can trick people into just considering the content in a different way, like in a more serious, more entertainment-driven way, to see it for what it is, rather than in the context of a random YouTube channel that otherwise makes, relatively low quality content, or the official Blender channel that otherwise does stuff relating to software development and updates and conferences and stuff like that, But okay, let's think about the more realistic side. If we create a website to host this interface, that requires money. And websites nowadays, they can be quite cheap to make. It kind of depends how you build them. If you build it kind of more manually on a cloud computing service, then billing's a bit confusing, but generally scales up depending on the bandwidth, how much information shared, the number of requests, general storage space, etc. Using cloud compute services like Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, they're kind of a bit finicky, not really fun to work with, bit of a waste of time. You've got things like Squarespace, which is what I use for my personal website, CurtisHolt.online, which has a really good pricing model in the way that it's quite affordable, but it's just got like flat pricing per month or annually that does not scale up with bandwidth. That's something really important that I like about the pricing. But the problem is, when you have stuff like that, there are limitations in other areas. So for example, you're quite limited in terms of how you can modify the interface in Squarespace, how many different content elements you can have. It's kind of, I think about it more like the Apple ecosystem in a way, where not as modifiable, but they just try and make it a nice experience within the limits of what you can do. But then there's things like Webflow, which I haven't really experimented with, but it seems like it's a step further in the customization direction from something like Squarespace, where you can do more with it, and there are more integrations. For example, if you wanted a member system, there's Member Stack, I think. But the pricing model is different in the way that there are bandwidth limits, or rather there is no complete flat pricing rate. They will show pricing rates, but there's always a caveat that, if you go over this amount, then we'll have to talk about enterprise plans and stuff like that, which is annoying for an independent wanting to make something, because even though we may never reach those limits, we like the possibility of being able to pass those limits without having to worry about money, considering we don't make that much money anyway, especially not when distributing mostly free projects, which will be the end of me. Consider donating and signing up to my Patreon. Also, thank you to everyone that already has, because you're fantastic and you're helping to offset the mass anxiety. Anyway, the Webflow system seems more like what would be appropriate for this kind of interface, where we're trying to find that balance in between something that's easily customizable, isn't too much of a time investment, the pricing is quite easy to understand compared to more regular compute platforms, and there are good integrations. So if I was going to build a website like that, I would look into something like Webflow. But then, okay, I kind of have this policy of not investing money into something unless it's generating money at the same time, which is a policy I don't follow very strongly. Once again, lots of free projects. But also sometimes I just make bad time investment choices, but for good reasons, I would say. I just did a private personalized tutorial for someone that didn't even ask for it. I just thought it'd be useful for them. And I was sitting there thinking, I would charge a lot of money for this if someone actually just asked for it, but I just did it for free. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh wait, okay, maybe I should work on other things instead. Anyway, for the website to stay active, it needs a source of income, which is a problem because obviously we want it to be a free and open thing where anyone can come and watch. But then again, if it's ever popular in the future, then that'd be I wouldn't necessarily say a mass amount of bandwidth, because if we're just streaming from YouTube, then we don't need to worry about the majority of the data, because that's between YouTube and the client, right? Or the viewer, not the client. So bandwidth would mostly come in the form of the image content that builds up the website, makes it pretty, all the branding, the slightly blurred background images that have been darkened slightly, representing parts of the short film, so people have a nice app-like interface as they're browsing through, very modern user interface design, all of that stuff. So there needs to be some form of income. We could of course just do it through donations on the website, which realistically might become self-sufficient, because once again, we don't have to worry about the majority of the bandwidth, but donations are nothing to rely on. If it's just a one-off cost, it's very intermittent. It's very difficult to, rely, because there's no stability per se. Rather, if you're doing one-shot donations, you need to think about it more like a pool, and it's just building up a pool, and then you kind of extrapolate that pool out into the future and say, okay, well, at the moment, we know we can last for another 16 months or something. on the website. It's not sustainable forever, if that makes sense. But then again, most services aren't anyway. So it raises a question about money-making potential in the form of maybe doing exclusive content that people can pay for on the site. Things like more curated behind-the-scenes content for the animated shorts done in collaboration with the creators. Alternatively, if setting up like a member system for the website is a functional idea, most likely third-party integrations, then maybe there could be a feature for like paying accounts where people could like, you know, keep favorite lists of what they've watched or something like that. But again, there's an element of complexity there that probably won't be worth it and kind of goes against like the openness of the site. But again, that would also only really be a good idea to invest time in if there was a substantial user base for the site. Because when you think about, you know, what kind of percentage of people would you have signing up for extra account features when everything is already immediately accessible, you'd be looking at like 0.00001% of an audience or something like that, maybe less. It's kind of like Patreon, you know, 0.000000001%. But anyway, so I kind of like the idea more of exclusive content that people can purchase through the site that they can watch, or maybe, you know, some resources, but it'd be nice having, yeah, a little bit extra. So there are two ways that could go. It could just be curated content created by people working on the website, strictly for the purpose of being sold, where all revenue goes back to the website, or the alternative could be collaboration content done with creators with the possibility of giving them revenue splits, although because I don't want to set up a company, I probably wouldn't want to do that, and revenue splits are possible, but a bit complicated when it comes to me, because I'm self-employed and doing the tax is going to be a bit complicated, saying, oh, actually, you know, that's an expenditure, but it's kind of a royalty. But then, you know, you extrapolate that into the future. Like, imagine if the website ever does well in like 20 years, and then you've got like 1,000 creators with revenue splits on exclusive content, and you think, okay, well, what is my bank statement going to look like? So that's another consideration. It's like, okay, well, theoretically, if I did this project in the future, every idea, extrapolating it into the future, is it going to make me need to have to make a company to deal with it? And I always want the answer to be no, for the sake of simplicity. So revenue splits, maybe not a good idea. So it would be in-house generated exclusive content that people can optionally pay for, which also helps to support the website hosting. That way people could help to keep the project active while also getting value back in some form. But yeah, anyways, that's just some thoughts about the Blender Cinema project, kind of thinking about the next step. Okay, if we're going to approach actually making it, then what level of complexity do we want to aim for? What kinds of services do we want to use? And how are we going to maintain the upkeep? So the actual realistic cost of creating something, keeping it active. The next stage after this, I guess, would be prototyping. But, you know, we're not there yet. And maybe I never will, but it'll be interesting to see what people think. I just haven't done this thing before where like we raise an idea and then get feedback about it and then bounce back and forth. It's pretty interesting. Oh, I don't think I've ever explained these shirts either. Why is Curtis wearing Warner Brothers and DC? So I won't go into too many details. My dad's a special effects supervisor who does some stuff for Warner Brothers. Well, clearly. I've done some work for them in the past, like trainee stuff and some software dev stuff for one of the robotic companies. And then occasionally I do like the shirts for the crew when they just need someone to quickly bash up a design to get printed up for the different crew members. So there's a lot of shirts laying around. But, you know, I don't talk about my family that much. I like to keep some stuff private. There should be some degree of separation between like my work and my home life, I feel like, even though I record everything in my bedroom. But yeah, maybe one day I'll be able to get my dad on a video and yeah, share some interesting stories, but we'll see. So we've spoken about the Blender Cinema idea, and we're going to move on to another subject now, which is my thoughts on Avatar 2. And don't worry, I'm going to try to make this non-spoilery as much as I can. There may be like some general synopsis points I touch on, but yeah, if you haven't seen it, I'll try not to spoil anything important. What I'll say is, I mean, it's been a long time since the first film, and I do remember going and seeing it. I watched it at Greenwich. There's an Odeon in Greenwich, and it was a kind of cool place to see it. I'm alright saying the location of a place like that because I don't live near to it, so that's fine. It was really cool seeing it in 3D, and even back then it was impressive, right? And I was thinking, well, is there a point of diminishing returns? Like, is this new installment going to be as impactful as the first one? And what I'll say is that, you know, in terms of feeling impressed, I think I kind of was as impressed as the first film, or rather as I felt watching the first film, because in the second one there's so much going on, there's so much detail. And not just that, like there's quite a large variety of like types of scenes and environments that you'll see in the film. You know, even different types of surfaces and styles, architecture, cultural elements, spacey stuff. You know, they clearly spend a large amount of time designing the world and putting it all together. And oh my days, the amount of rendering time and effort that must have gone into making this film is insane. Like it's over 3 hours long. I think it was like, what, 3.5 hours? Let me check this. Okay, 3 hours, 12 minutes it says on Google. And every single frame frame feels like it's something that would just make my computer explode. The 3D did feel a lot better this time than it had done before, but then again, it's the kind of thing where I kind of forget that it's 3D. You know, you forget that you're watching it through glasses, where in a way it still feels like a bit of a novelty, but maybe that kind of just depends on having a lot of experience in 3D and experience in virtual reality, where the novelty factor kind of wears off a bit quickly. Similarly though, another thing that wears off quickly is the knowledge that the film is an animated film. Now of course it uses mocap in various different ways, but you know, the film is largely animated CG characters, right? And you quite quickly forget that, which I thought was really interesting. It didn't take long to kind of, you know, suspend the disbelief. And, you know, I think a certain amount of that is to do with the animation, obviously being like really, really high quality. Like, even, especially the facial stuff. Like when you watch the film, you'll notice that. I think maybe because it's so close to kind of human faces as well. Like there's a lot you can kind of project from a human actor onto, you know, an avatar. But yeah, it feels like they got the micro animations down, which is something that maybe lets other films down in the kind of CG category. There are lots of like tiny, like minuscule quirks or imperfections in how humans move in a realistic way that I feel like they kind of nailed it on this film. I heard there was like a difference in frame rate throughout the film, and I saw some people complaining about that on Twitter, but as I watched it, I never even noticed it if it was there. Again, maybe that's because when I watch films and shows, I don't have that problem that a lot of people have where they say, oh, I can never watch a film the same way again, or I can never play a game the same way again. Like when they start studying it and they're like, oh, I'm just looking for all the imperfections. I'm like, nah, like that's never been a problem with me. Like just enjoy it. Just sit back and experience the content for how it was intended for the audience. So no, like the frame rate difference, I never even picked up on that. The length of the film didn't bother me either. Quite a long film, but at the same time, it's been like, what, 13 years or something since the last one? So with that in mind, I think we were well overdue for more content in the world of Pandora. So I would have happily sat in there for an entire day, you know, watching just POV experiences inside the Pandoran landscape. Yeah, I thought it was great. Like, even the story was pretty nice. It's a very family-centric story, which you would probably be able to tell if you watch the trailers as well. Because you can see watching the trailer, there's the main character that's carried over from the previous film, and they have, like, their family there, and you'll learn more about that in the film. In that way, I think James Cameron has cleverly made a film that kind of projects a message, because the Avatar films have always been about that. They're kind of like this anti-colonialist projects, should we say. You know, there's a lot of the big, angry American people coming in and killing everything and taking all the resources, you know. So there is a definite message behind it, but in this film it's interesting because like it doesn't necessarily feel like there's one main character. It feels like there's a couple or a few main characters, because we're kind of seeing different stories overlap for these characters, which I think is quite interesting, because that also opens up a lot of questions about the lore, because there are some questions that are opened up that aren't answered in this film, and you think, oh okay, they're probably going to get to answering those in the next couple or the next few films. Whereas for other characters it seems like they start their story arcs and do finish them in this film. So yeah, it was quite interesting seeing that, because that's like a kind of different design story-wise to the original Avatar. Just a bit. I mean, they always had these overlapping stories in the first Avatar film, especially since some of the characters kind of split off from each other, and you need to kind of understand what's happening in the different parts of the world, but this felt different, and I think better in my opinion. But it's weird, I've heard like so many subjective opinions about the story. Apparently a lot of people didn't like it before it came out. But you know, my friend Sharon just sent me a chart, and the film's already raised about $1.5 billion worldwide, so that's very impressive for the amount of time it's been out. It is also quite an emotional film, and not just in the traditional way where there's a very definite narrative and you follow it, things happen to characters and you feel, you know, kind of different degrees of emotion as they're going through different experiences. You know, that's kind of like the guided method. But I think a little bit of secret genius in the storytelling that maybe some people didn't pay too much attention to was that there are a couple of really key moments in the film where I could kind of feel a moment of like fear or dread that weren't guided narrative moments. And a lot of that's to do with like the artistry, what you're seeing, the music, the sound design, and the reactions of different characters. And it feels like you're being kind of encouraged to feel a certain way just based on how those scenes have been laid out. You know, there are some moments where there's absolutely no dialogue whatsoever, no discussion, no fighting or anything like that. You're just watching stuff happening, and then you're feeling an emotional reaction to that. And I think it's very difficult to create experiences that do that. And if there is anyone that has watched the film, because of course I'm trying not to be spoilery, I'll say two words: Arrival and Hunt, and maybe you'll be able to figure out like what parts of the films those are. But one more thing to talk about in terms of like the technical aspect of the film, because this may well be one of the most technically complex films ever made up to this point. You know, I sit and ask myself, the technology invented and made for this film, how much is this actually going to push the industry forward? Like, is this gonna make visual effects technology more accessible for people? And I'm not really sure about that. I'm not sure if it is. Or whether it's what I would call like a crisis moment. And that's not using the definition of the word crisis as in like, oh, a midlife crisis. No, I mean like in terms of the game industry, there was a game called Crysis, Crysis. And the thing about that game was it was such a step ahead of its time in terms of graphical technology that it became a joke that no computer could run it, like to the max. And even like, I don't know, I guess 10 years afterwards, it was still a graphically intensive game. It also did things that games just can't be bothered to do nowadays. I can't remember, you start off that game, you're in a jungle on a tropical island, and right from the get-go, you can experiment with physics because, you know, you get your pistol out, you shoot some palm trees in the same place, and the palm tree breaks apart where you shot it, and then it falls to the ground and makes this kind of like soft collapsing sound as like the palm leaves push down on it. And this came out ages ago now. It's still a good looking game. So a crisis moment for me in that regard is where something is created mostly in isolation, creating its own technology, pushing boundaries, but because it's just created all this tech in isolation, it doesn't really flow out to the rest of the industry. So I'll be interested in doing some more reading about the technology used for Avatar and whether any of that is kind of like trickling outwards, the knowledge picked up, the, you know, tools worked on to make all this possible, because I think that would be interesting to know more about. So the last subject I want to talk about in this video, this lovely podcast episode, is game modding, video game modding. You may or may not know I do have a little bit of experience with game development. I won't go into that in too much detail. It's not the favorite project I've ever done. And in the same way that I look back on my videos and think, ugh, cringe, I look back on old projects and go, ugh, you know, so that's why I don't really like to talk about really old projects. But back before I was getting into anything, back before I took like programming seriously back in school, the first foray I had into like digital creation was video game modding. And I think specifically, it was even the first time I used Blender was for Oblivion modding, the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. I had like a little silver Dell laptop. I say little, it was quite heavy and chunky, but you know, I'd play Oblivion on that and it was fun messing around, playing around with things. I would make like little underground bases and have a couple of like skeleton guards that couldn't die. They would like reanimate whenever they were killed. And using Blender back then, it was quite complex for the time, I think, because it required plugins that could export objects to this very specific format the Bethesda game engine was using. And I can't remember what it was called, but it had like a really weird, there might be like an X in there, not FBX. It was like, I think it might have been like a 4-letter format or something. But there were like several different formats. And I remember the Blender interface was the really old one where all the interface was mostly at the bottom of the screen. You know, it was the most confusing thing ever. But I did have fun playing around with it. And then, you know, I would mod other games. I'd play around quite a bit with Fallout 3 as well. I'd show some of my friends in school, that kind of stuff. And that would always be fun when it worked. There was always like some kind of version mismatch problem as well. Even Kerbal Space Program, when that came out, did some modding. But anyway, the reason why I want to talk about this is I was really interested when Bethesda Game Studios announced that they were going to be doing this Creation Club thing back in the day, where people could pitch more complex mod ideas that Bethesda would review. Like they would review the idea, review the creation process, and put on sale, and then you could get like a revenue split from the sales made on it. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. That would allow people, potential mod creators, to like make their dreams come true. Wake up, work, and make mods every day and make money from it. Like that's a fantastic idea. In the same way that now, you know, people that like doing 3D artwork, they can wake up, make 3D artwork or tools or resources, etc., add-ons in my case as well, for something they love, a piece of software, Blender, kind of like a video game to me anyway, and then sell the stuff they make to make money from it. And I was like, oh wow, this is really cool. Like a company's finally getting on board with that idea. And I was like super interested in maybe making like, you know, actual experiences for these games, Skyrim, Fallout 4, and wherever else it was going to be implemented. But there was such a big backlash to the idea, and that actually kind of disappointed me a bit. People were like, oh no, mods were always free and now they're going to be like paid from it. This is exploitative. And I was like, oh, that kind of sucks, because now there's a bunch of like aspiring mod creators that have to go and get crappy jobs now. And I've always been about, you know, kind of democratizing creation and I guess, like revenue splits in that way. But I heard a rumor that Bethesda may be experimenting with the idea of bringing in a new kind of marketplace for mod creators, one that's a bit more accessible, maybe kind of a bit more along the lines of how Minecraft does it. I think what they've seen is that for games with like extremely popular mod communities, the potential for the longevity of the game is like exponentially multiplied by the freedom people have to create content for it. And the quality of the content created for it is going to, again, exponentially increase if there's potential for people to turn it into a living, where people can like reinvest money back into the project. So I just wanted to talk about this because if they do bring in a more open marketplace type system where Bethesda actually allows people to make money off of mods that they create for the games without having to go through like a super complex review process, because before it was like you would have to come up with a concept, they would pay you for the concept, then they would pay you at very specific stages and they would control every single stage of the project, almost like kind of reviewing it as you went along. It doesn't really, for people that want to experiment and see what they can create, not even necessarily reaching an end point, but maybe come up with new ideas along the way, like how we do when we create stuff for Blender. Just figure if they had a new marketplace type system where they weren't controlling every aspect of every idea and they let people just, form their own teams and make content to put out there, maybe make some money, then I would be interested in giving it a go. Starfield's coming out. I always wanted to make like a big RPG space game. And then I sit here thinking, well, if that was ever a thing, why would I make a new game from scratch? I wouldn't even do that. I wouldn't have the time for it. But if I could make a really cool narrative mod using my 3D art skills to create like some really cool content that people haven't seen before, and I have access to some resources and tons of other creators, and we could kind of team up and make a really cool, unique, high quality narrative experience equivalent to like a really cool expansion or piece of downloadable content, and then actually sell that for a game like Starfield, then I think that would be really cool and something I would actually invest time in. But I still think we've got a little way before companies are okay with people making money off of mods, actually just making a mod and then selling it directly. Anyway, yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about. Hopefully you found this interesting. We spoke about the Blender Cinema idea, kind of going over what the idea was and then thinking about some early considerations for making that real. How do you keep the site up and running? What kinds of services should we use? Things like that. Again, not saying I will create this, but I think it's nice running through these exercises because maybe it also inspires you to kind of think about your potential ideas in different phases as well. And we spoke about Avatar 2. I thought it was a fantastic film. If you haven't seen it, please watch it. And then lastly, video game modding, because it's something I am definitely interested in, but I just don't think the environment is there for it yet, or the market isn't ready for it. Anyway, yeah, if you made it to the end of this video, please put a rocket ship emoji in the comments so I can see who made it this far. So yeah, have a fantastic day everyone, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the notification bell, check out my products and subscribe to the Patreon. Okay, thanks, bye.